Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It started with the house. Not just any house, but the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. It stood at the edge of a dense forest, its Gothic spires piercing the gray sky like jagged teeth. The windows were dark and lifeless, the paint peeling from the walls in long curling strips. It was the kind of house that whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. I never intended to buy it. I was just passing through the town of Blackwick, a forgotten little village nestled in the shadow of the mountains. But when I saw the for sale sign, something inside me stirred. It was as if the house itself was calling to me, its voice faint but insistent. Before I knew it, I was signing the papers and moving in. The first few days were uneventful. The house was cold and drafty, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. But it had a strange charm, a kind of melancholic beauty that I found oddly comforting. I spent my days exploring the rooms, each one filled with antique furniture and faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. The previous owners had left everything behind, as if they'd vanished in the night. Then, one evening, I heard the singing. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper. I thought it was the wind, or maybe the creaking of the old pipes. But as the days went on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a choir, their voices harmonizing in a haunting, otherworldly melody. The song had no words, but it filled me with a sense of longing, of loss. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo through the walls, the floors, the very air itself. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the singing followed me everywhere. Even when I left the house, it was in my dreams, in the rustling of the trees, in the distant tolling of the church bell. It was as if the house had claimed me, and there was no escape.
Oh.
One night I decided to find the source of the singing. I grabbed a flashlight and began to search the house, room by room. The sound led me to the basement, a place I'd avoided since moving in. The stairs were steep and narrow, the wood creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I descended, the singing growing louder with each step. The basement was a labyrinth of stone walls and low vaulted ceilings. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with strange, unidentifiable objects, jars of dried herbs, bundles of feathers, and what looked like animal bones. In the center of the room was a large circular table, its surface covered in intricate carvings, and then I saw it, a door, hidden in the shadows. It was small and unassuming, its surface covered in peeling paint. But as I approached, the singing grew louder, more urgent. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, as if the sound was resonating with something deep inside me. I opened the door. The room beyond was small and circular, its walls lined with candles that flickered and danced in the cold air. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on the pedestal was a book. It was old and weathered, its cover made of cracked leather, and its pages yellowed with age. The singing seemed to emanate from it, the voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. I reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings, their ink faded and smudged. The writing was difficult to read, but I could make out a few words. The silent quiet. The ritual, the veil. As I flipped through the pages, I began to piece together the story. The house had once belonged to a group of occultists who sought to commune with beings from beyond the veil. They believed that by performing a ritual, they could summon these beings and gain their power. But something went wrong. The beings broke through the veil, and the occultists were consumed, their souls trapped in a state of eternal torment. The singing was their voices, calling out from the other side. The ritual was described in detail, its steps precise and deliberate. It required a sacrifice, a life, willingly given. The book warned of the consequences, of the price that must be paid, but it also promised power, knowledge, and a glimpse into the unknown. I don't know what compelled me to try it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, more primal, but I followed the instructions, gathering the necessary ingredients and drawing the symbols on the floor. The singing grew louder, more intense. As I worked, the voices harmonizing in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. When the ritual was complete, I stood in the center of the circle, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, the candles flickering and sputtering, and then I saw them, the beings from beyond the veil. They were tall and thin, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. They had no faces, no features, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning into my soul. They spoke, their voices a cacophony of whispers and screams. They offered me power, knowledge, and a glimpse into the unknown. But there was a price, a life, willingly given. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that I woke up in the basement, the candles extinguished, and the book gone. The singing had stopped, but the house felt different, as if it was alive, watching, waiting, and sometimes late at night, I hear it again, the singing, faint and distant, calling me back to the basement. I don't know if I'll answer, but I know that the house hasn't finished with me yet. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, like the delicate scrape of a fingernail against wood. At first I thought it was my imagination. The old house creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, its aging bones protesting the weight of time. But this sound was different. It wasn't the house settling, it was something alive. I had moved into the house on Hollow Creek Road just a week earlier. It was a quaint two-story Victorian, with peeling paint, and a wrap-around porch that sagged in the middle. The real estate agent had called it charming and full of character, but I knew the truth. It was cheap, and I was desperate. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start, and this house, with its sprawling yard and quiet neighborhood, seemed like the perfect place to rebuild my life. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking boxes, and my evenings curled up on the couch with a book, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a blanket. But on the seventh night, the scratching began. It started just as I was drifting off to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound tugging at the edges of my consciousness. At first I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to a mouse or some other small creature seeking shelter from the cold. But as the minutes passed, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. I sat up, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. I held my breath, listening. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard something else, a whisper. It was so soft I almost missed it. A faint murmur that seemed to rise from the very depths of the house. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, desperate, as if someone or something was begging for help. I told myself it was nothing, the wind perhaps, or the pipes groaning in the walls. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in the house with me, something that didn't belong. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a fog. I told myself I had imagined the whispers, that the scratching was just a noise. But as I went about my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air in the house felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. That night, the scratching returned. This time it was louder, more frantic. I lay in bed, my body rigid, as the sound echoed through the room, and then, once again, the whispers began. This time they were clearer, more distinct. I could almost make out the words. Help us. The voice was faint, almost childlike, but there was something wrong with it, something unnatural. It sent a chill down my spine, my skin prickling with goosebumps. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they were almost deafening. Help us, please. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the blankets and stumbled out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and flicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The scratching seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near the closet. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the closet, the scratching stopped. The whispers fell silent. The room was eerily quiet. The only sound the rapid thud of my heartbeat. I shone the flashlight into the corner, the beam of light illuminating the worn wooden floorboards, and that's when I saw it. A small jagged crack ran along the edge of the floor, barely visible in the dim light. I knelt down, running my fingers over the rough wood. The crack was wider than it had first appeared, deep enough to slip a finger. As I pressed against it, the board shifted slightly, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. My breath caught in my throat. The hole was small, no larger than a fist, but it seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the inky blackness below. I shone the flashlight into the void, but the beam of light was swallowed by the darkness. And then, from deep within the hole, I heard it again, the whispers, "Help us." Over the next few days, the scratching and whispers became a constant presence in the house. No matter where I went, I could feel it, the weight of something unseen, watching me, waiting. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head, but the evidence was impossible to deny. The crack in the floorboards grew wider, the whispers louder, until they were impossible to ignore. I began to research the history of the house, desperate for answers. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family, the Holloways. They had lived there for decades, until one night, in 1923, when the entire family vanished without a trace. The house had stood empty for years, until it was purchased by a new family in the 1950s. They too disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The pattern continued over the years. Families would move in, only to vanish without a trace. The house became known as the Hollow Creek House of Horrors, a place where people went in but never came out. And now, I was living in it. One night, the whispers became unbearable. They were no longer faint murmurs, but loud, desperate cries, echoing through the house like a chorus of the damned. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and returned to the bedroom, determined to uncover the source of the noise. I pried up the floorboards, the wood splintering and cracking as I worked. The hole beneath was larger than I had realized, a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch on forever. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, my hands trembling as I peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Bones, dozens of them, piled haphazardly in the dirt. Some were small, the fragile remains of children, while others were larger, the skeletons of adults. And in the center of the pile, something moved, a shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, writhing and twisting like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost deafening. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow began to rise from the hole, its form shifting and changing, until it took on the shape of a person, but it wasn't human. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice, a chorus of the dead. "You've set us free." I don't remember how I got out of the house. All I know is that I woke up in the hospital, my body bruised and broken, with no memory of what had happened. The house on Hollow Creek Road burned to the ground that night, taking its secrets with it. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, and I know, deep down, that they're coming for me. It was the kind of house that made you pause, not because it was old or decrepit, but because it felt wrong, the kind of wrong that you couldn't quite put into words. The windows seemed to stare at you like hollow eyes, and the air around it was always a few degrees colder than the rest of the street. But for Emma, it was home, or at least, it would be. Emma had always been drawn to old houses. She loved their history, their charm, the way they seemed to hold secrets in. So when she found the Victorian a house for sale at a price that seemed too good to be true, she didn't hesitate. The real estate agent had been vague about the previous owners, muttering something about unfortunate circumstances, but Emma didn't care. She was in love with the house's high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and the way the sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows. The first night she spent in the house, she felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so soft that she thought it might be the wind, but the windows were closed. She shook it off, blaming her imagination. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder. At first, they were just background noise, like a radio playing in another room, but soon she began to make out words. The whispers beneath the floorboards. It was the kind of house that made you pause when you first saw it, not because it was particularly old or decrepit, but because it seemed out of place. Tucked at the end of a quiet suburban street, it stood alone, surrounded by towering oak trees that cast long, jagged shadows across its weathered facade. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper, but to me it felt like a sanctuary, a fresh start, a place where I could finally escape the noise of the city and the memories that haunted me. I moved in on a cold October afternoon. The air was crisp and the leaves had already begun to turn, painting the ground in shades of amber and crimson. The house creaked as I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. It smelled of dust and damp wood, but I didn't mind. I was too busy imagining the life I could build here. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my belongings, set up my bed in the master bedroom, and fell asleep to the sound of wind rustling through the trees. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things. Small things at first, a faint tapping sound coming from the walls, a cold draft that seemed to seep through the cracks in the floorboards, the way my dog Max would growl at the empty corners of the room. Then came the whispers. It started one night as I was drifting off to sleep. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was as if someone was speaking just below the threshold of hearing, their words muffled and indistinct. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. The whispers stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, stress maybe, or fatigue from the move. But the next night, it happened again. This time the whispers were louder, more insistent. I could almost make out the words, but they slipped away before I could grasp them. I got out of bed and searched the house, turning on every light, checking every room. There was no one there. The nights that followed were worse. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I began to hear them during the day as well. They seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, rising up through the cracks and filling the air with their eerie cadence. Max refused to go near the living room. His ears flattened against his head as he whimpered and paced. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the house settling, or the pipes, or some trick of the acoustics. But deep down I knew it was something else, something alive. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and pried up one of the floorboards in the living room. The wood splintered and cracked, and a cloud of dust billowed up into the air. I shone the flashlight into the darkness below, my hands trembling. At first I saw nothing but dirt and cobwebs, but as I leaned closer I noticed something strange. The ground beneath the house wasn't solid. It was hollow, like a tunnel or a chamber. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. The whispers weren't coming from the house, they were coming from beneath it. I don't know what compelled me to climb down there. Maybe it was curiosity, or desperation, or some twisted sense of duty. But before I could talk myself out of it, I lowered myself into the hole and dropped into the darkness below. The air was damp and cold, and the walls of the tunnel were slick with moisture. I shone the flashlight ahead of me, the beam cutting through the gloom. The whispers were louder now, echoing off the walls and filling my ears with their maddening rhythm. I followed the sound, my footsteps squelching in the mud. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning like the coils of a serpent. But eventually I reached a chamber. It was small and circular, with a low ceiling and walls that seemed to pulse and writhe in the dim light. And in the center of the chamber, lying on a crude stone altar, was a body. It was human, or at least it had been once. The flesh was withered and decayed, the skin stretched tight over brittle bones. But what horrified me most was the face. The mouth was open in a silent scream, the lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth, and the eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled backward, my stomach churning, but as I turned to leave, the whispers stopped. The chamber fell silent, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the walls. That's when I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, slithering across the walls like living things. They twisted and writhed, their forms shifting and changing until they resembled human figures. But they were wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in impossible ways, and their eyes glowed with a sickly green light. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the tunnel, or how I made it back to the house. All I remember is the sound of the shadows chasing me, their whispers filling my ears as I clawed my way back to the surface. I left the house that night, and never went back. I couldn't. The whispers followed me, even after I moved to a new city, a new state. They're with me now. They're with me now, as I write this, their voices growing louder with each passing day. I don't know what they want, or why they chose me, but I do know this, they're not done with me yet, and neither is the house. The Hollowing, the town of Black Hollow, wasn't on any map. It wasn't listed in travel guides, and even GPS systems seemed to glitch when you got too close. It was the kind of place you only found if you were lost, or if it wanted you to find it. I stumbled upon it one rainy October evening, my car sputtering to a halt on the edge of a dense fog-shrouded forest. The nearest gas station was miles away, and my phone had no signal. I had no choice but to walk. The road into Black Hollow was narrow and winding, lined with gnarled trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of my footsteps on the gravel. As I approached the town, the fog grew heavy, obscuring everything but the faint outlines of buildings in the distance. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no cars, no people, no signs of life. The houses were old and weathered, their windows dark and lifeless. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flickering street lamp that cast long, wavering shadows. It felt like a place frozen in time, forgotten by the rest of the world. I found the town's only inn at the end of the main street. It was a two-story building with a sagging roof and a faded sign that read Black Hollow in. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled faintly above my head. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of wood smoke and mildew. A man stood behind the counter, his face obscured by the shadows. "Room for the night," I said, my voice echoing in the empty room. The man nodded silently and handed me a key. His hands were gnarled and trembling, his skin pale and paper-thin. He didn't speak, but his eyes, deep-set and hollow, followed me as I climbed the stairs to my room. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a rickety chair, and a single window that looked out over the forest. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Something about this place felt wrong, but I was too exhausted to care. I fell asleep almost instantly. The dream started that night. I was standing in the forest, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath my feet was soft and spongy. I could hear something moving in the distance, a low rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo through the trees. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw them, shadows, dozens of them, emerging from the fog. They were tall and thin, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. They had no faces, no features, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning into my soul. They surrounded me, their whispers filling the air. A cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was dark, but I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. I told myself it was just a dream, but the sound lingered, growing louder. The next morning, I decided to explore the town. The streets were still empty, the houses silent and lifeless. I wandered aimlessly, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I turned a corner, I noticed a small church at the end of the street. It was an old, crumbling building, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. Something about it drew me in. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of incense and decay. The pews were empty, the altar covered in a thick layer of dust, but what caught my eye was the mural on the wall behind the altar. It was a massive, intricate painting, its colors faded and cracked with age. It depicted a forest, much like the one outside the town. but there was something off about it. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like claws. In the center of the mural was a figure, a tall, shadowy being with glowing green eyes. Surrounding it were smaller figures, their faces twisted in agony. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the mural. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. But before I could think too much about it, I heard a sound behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was an old woman, her face lined with age, and her eyes clouded with cataract. She was dressed in a tattered black dress, her hands clutching a wooden cane. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "This is no place for outsiders. I'm just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. My car broke down, and I needed a place to steady. The woman shook her head, her eyes filled with fear.
"You don't understand.
This town, it's cursed."
The hollowing, it takes everyone in the end."
"The hollowing?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. The woman hesitated, then gestured for me to follow her. She led me to a small room at the back of the church, where a dusty old book lay on a table. She opened it to a page filled with handwritten notes and drawings. "The hollowing is an ancient curse," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It began centuries ago, when the town was first founded. The people here made a pact with something that lives in the forest. They promised it sacrifices in exchange for protection, but the thing, it wasn't satisfied. It wanted more. It began to take people, one by one, until the town was nearly empty. They became hollow, empty shells of what they once were." I stared at the book, my mind reeling. The drawings were eerily similar to the mural, the shadowy figure, the twisted trees, the agonized faces. It was like something out of a nightmare.
"Why are you telling me this?"
I asked, my voice trembling. The woman's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something in them. A flicker of pity, or maybe regret. "Because you're already marked," she said. "I can see it in your eyes. The hollowing, it's already begun." That night, the dreams returned. This time, I was in the church, standing before the mural. The shadowy figure stepped out of the painting, its glowing eyes fixed on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. I tried to run, but the shadows surrounded me, their cold, bony fingers closing around my arm. I woke up screaming, my body drenched and sweaty. The room was dark, but I could still feel the shadows, their presence lingering like a battle. I grabbed my bag and ran downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of this town, but as I stepped outside, I realized something was wrong. The streets were no longer empty. The shadows were everywhere. Their glowing eyes, watching me from
every corner.
They moved slowly, deliberately, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. I tried to run, but they were too fast. They surrounded me, their whispers filling my... And then I saw the shadowy figure from the mural. It stood at the end of the street, its glowing eyes. It raised a hand, and when the shadows surged forward, their cold fingers closing around me. I don't remember what happened after that. All I knew that it woke up in my car. The engine running and the gas tank full. The town of Black Hollow was gone, as if it had never existed. But the whispers, they're still with me. They follow me everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see them, the glowing green eyes, staring back at me. The forgotten station. It began with a train ticket, not a modern digital one, but an old yellowed slip of paper I found tucked inside a second-hand book. I bought at a flea market. The book itself was unremarkable, a faded collection of Victorian poetry, but the ticket caught my eye. It was stamped with a name I didn't recognize. Eldridge Station. The date was smudged, but the destination was clear. Terminus. I'm not sure why. I kept it. Maybe it was the mystery, the sense of something forgotten, or maybe it was the faint, almost imperceptible scent of coal smoke and damp that clung to the paper. Whatever the reason, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Instead, I tucked it into my wallet, where it stayed for weeks, forgotten. Then, one rainy evening, I found myself at a train station. I don't remember how I got there, or why I was there. The station was old, its brick walls crumbling, and its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. The platform was empty, the tracks rusted and overgrown with weeds, the air was thick with the smell of rain and decay, and the only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. I was about to leave when I saw a train, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. It was an old steam locomotive, its black paint peeling and its brass fittings tarnished. The conductor stood on the platform, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He didn't speak, but he held out his hand as if waiting for something. That's when I remembered the ticket. I pulled it from my wallet and handed it to him. He examined it briefly, then nodded and gestured for me to board the train. I hesitated, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach, but something compelled me to step inside. The interior of the train was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The seats were upholstered in faded velvet, the walls paneled with dark wood. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and coal smoke, and the only light came from flickering gas lamps mounted on the walls. The other passengers sat sullenly, their faces obscured by shadows. None of them looked at me as I took my seat. The train began to move, its wheels clattering against the tracks. I stared out the window watching as the station disappeared into the darkness. The landscape outside was a blur of shadows and mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I couldn't tell how fast we were going or where we were headed. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the minutes blending into hours. Eventually, the train began to slow. The conductor appeared at the front of the car, his voice low and gravelly. "Eldridge Station," he announced. "Next stop, terminus." I didn't remember standing up or leaving the train, but suddenly I was on the platform, the cold night air biting at my skin. The station was even more decrepit than the one I'd left behind. Its walls covered in ivy, and its roof partially collapsed. The only light came from a single flickering lamp mounted above the platform. I was about to turn back when I noticed something, a figure standing at the edge of the platform. It was a woman, her face pale, and her eyes hollow. She was dressed in a tattered garment, her hair hanging in straight strands around her face. She didn't speak, but she gestured for me to follow her. I don't know why I did. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something deeper, more primal, but I followed her into the station, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The woman led me to a door at the end of the hall, its surface covered in peeling paint. She pushed it open and stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but something compelled me to follow. The room behind was small and circular, its walls lined with shelves filled with strange unidentifiable objects. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. On the table was a book, its cover worn and cracked with age. I opened it, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings, their ink faded and smooth. The writing was difficult to read, but I could make out a few words: the forgotten station, the veil, the watchers. As I flipped through the pages, I began to piece together the story. Eldridge Station wasn't just a place, it was a gateway, a point where the veil between worlds was thin. The watchers were beings that existed on the other side, their forms shifting and incomprehensible. They had been summoned centuries ago by a group of occultists who sought to harness their power, but something went wrong. The watchers broke through the veil, and the station was abandoned, left to decay. The woman appeared beside me, her voice a faint whisper. "They're still here," she said. "They're waiting." I turned to ask her what she meant, but she was gone. The room was empty. The door closed. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The watchers were coming. I don't remember how I got up at the door or how I made it back to the train. All I remember is the sound of their footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing in the darkness. The train was waiting for me, its engine sifting steam. I climbed aboard just as the shadows began to close in. The ride back was a blur. The other passengers were gone, the car empty and silent. The conductor didn't speak, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. When the train finally stopped, I was back at the station where I'd started. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to lighten. I stepped off the train, my legs trembled, and turned to look back, but the train was gone, the tracks empty, and I don't know if what happened was real or just a dream, but the ticket is still in my wallet. It's empty as freight, and its surface stained with something dark and sticky, and sometimes late at night, I hear the sound of a train whistle,
faint and distant, calling me back to Eldritch Station. This story is designed to be deeply unsettling, with a slow build of tension and a lingering sense of dread. Let me know if you'd like me to expand on any part of it or add more eerie details. The town of Hollow Hill was a quiet, unassuming place, nestled deep in the woods. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever happened. But there was one story that everyone whispered about, a story so old that it had become more legend than truth. It was that story of the witch of Hollow Hill. No one knew her real name, or if they did, they never spoke it aloud. She was simply called the witch, and her name was enough to send shivers down the spines of even the bravest townsfolk. According to the legend, the witch had lived in a cabin deep in the woods, far from the town. She was said to be ancient, her face twisted and gnarled like the roots of the trees she lived. She had powers, dark, unnatural power, and she used them to curse anyone who crossed her. The story went like this. Decades ago, a group of children had ventured into the woods on a day. They were looking for the witch's cabin, not really believing she existed, but they found it, a small crumbling shack surrounded by dead trees, and a silence so heavy it felt like a living thing. The children, emboldened by their own bravado, had thrown rocks at the cabin, laughing and shouting insults. But they were laughed at when the door creaked open and the witch stepped up. She didn't say a word. She just stared at them with eyes that glowed like embers, and then she raised her hand. The children fled, but it was too late. One by one, they fell ill, their bodies racked with pain, and their minds filled with nightmares. Within a week, all of them were dead. The town buried them in the cemetery on the edge of the woods, and no one ever spoke of the witch again. But the legend never died. It lingered, passed down from generation to generation, a cautionary tale to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Most people didn't believe it. Of course, it was just a story. They said that there were some, mostly the older folks, who would glance toward the woods at night. She's still out there. Maggie had always been fascinated by the legend. She was new to Hollow Hill, having moved there after inheriting her mother's house. She didn't believe in witches or curses, but she loved a good story, and the Witch of Hollow Hill was the best one she'd ever heard. So when her friends suggested they go looking for the witch's cabin, she didn't hesitate. It's just for fun, she said, laughing. What's the worst that could happen? They set out at dusk, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure. The woods were dense and dark, the trees pressing in on all sides. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under their feet. It didn't take long for the mood to shift from excitement to unease. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, one of her friends said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. What if we actually find it? It will have a great story to tell, Maggie replied, though even she was starting to feel uneasy. The woods seemed to be closing in around them, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. And then they saw it. The cabin was exactly as the legend had described it, small and crumbling, with a roof that sagged under the weight of it. The windows were dark, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. The trees around it were dead, their branches twisted and bent, and the ground was littered with bullets. Maggie's friends had said tight, but she stepped forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Come on, she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Let's check it out. Let's check it out. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The air was thick with the smell of rot and molded, and the walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. The floor was littered with jar filled with unidentifiable substance, and in the center of the room was a large black cauldron. This is so creepy, one of her friends whispered. Let's get out of here. But Maggie wasn't ready to leave. She was too fascinated by the cabin, by the idea that the legend might actually be true. She picked up one of the jars, holding it up to the light. Inside was a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to move on its own. Put that down, her friend said, his voice trembled. Look, you don't know what that is. Maggie laughed, but the sound was hollow. Relax, it's probably just... She never finished the sentence. The door slammed shut behind them, plunging the cabin into darkness. The flashlights flickered and died, and the air grew cold. Maggie dropped the jar, and it shattered on the floor. The liquid spread like blood, and then they heard it, a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The symbols on the walls began to glow, casting an eerie green light that illuminated the room. The cauldron bubbled and hissed, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the witch. She was exactly as the witch had described her, ancient and twisted, her face a mask of hatred and malice. Her eyes glowed like embers, and her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. She raised a bony hand, and Maggie felt an invisible force grip her, lifting her off the ground. You shouldn't have come here, the witch hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. But now that you're here, you'll never leave. Maggie's friends screamed, but they were frozen in place, unable to move. The witch's eyes locked onto Maggie's, and she felt a cold, creeping sensation spread through her body, as if something were burrowing into her soul. You'll make a fine addition to my collection, the witch said, and then she began to chant. Her voice rising and falling in a language that sounded like the hissing of snakes. Maggie tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could feel her body changing, her skin hardening and cracking like bark, her limbs twisting and contorting. She looked down and saw that her hands were no longer hands. They were branches, more twisted like the trees outside. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the witch's smile, and tried until when Maggie's friends finally managed to escape the cabin. They were hysterical. They ran back to town, screaming about the witch and what she had done to Maggie. But when the townsfolk went to investigate, they found nothing. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. The woods were silent, and there was no trace of Maggie. The townsfolk dismissed the story as a prank, but Maggie's friends knew the truth. They had seen the witch, and they had seen what she had done. They never went into the woods again, and they never spoke of what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear a faint, guttural laugh coming from the woods, and they would glance toward the trees, their hearts pounding, and wonder if Maggie was still out there, trapped in the witch's curse. And if you ever find yourself in Hollow Hill, don't go into the woods, because the witch is still out there, waiting for her next victim.